Hi, welcome everybody to this discussion. We're delighted to have with us Olivia Kemp and Mark Connolly, who are two artists who last year began a podcast together, which they called Notes on a Painting. Each week they choose painting to introduce to each other, taking it in turns to talk about a painting in an accessible, educational, and friendly manner. But before we fully introduce our speakers, I just want to briefly introduce the Athena Art Foundation. My name is Abigail, and I'm the digital events manager for Athena. We are a UK-based art charity operating primarily online and founded by our wonderful director, Nicola Jennings, who is luckily here with us tonight as well. Our mission is to engage more audiences with pre-20th century art from all around the world in a fun way which brings more people into museums and galleries and also demonstrates its continued relevance today. So we also often speak to contemporary artists such as Olivia and Mark, who choose to explore the past and various traditions in their artworks. You can look at our YouTube channel to find a lot of these talks, including a recording of our recent live event with Eleanor Jackson, who curated the British Library's exhibition on medieval women, or a talk with Farkhonde Ahmadzada, a contemporary artist working with traditional Persian techniques of miniature painting. You can also have a look at our website or follow us on Instagram, where we often post shorter videos giving the stories behind artworks. So on to our introductions. Olivia Kemp is a British artist and draftswoman working with pen and ink. She's represented by James Freeman Gallery in London. She makes complex and detailed drawings, sometimes expansive, imagined, and surreal. Since her Richard Ford Award residency in Museo del Prado in 2015, much of her work is inspired by art history and the classical painters. Kemp and her work have featured on the BBC R4 Front Row, Marie Claire, The Evening Standard, Colnaghi Foundation Lates, Mashable, Colossal, and many more. Mark Connolly, who was born in Ballymena in 1991, is an artist, curator, and founder of Paint Talk. He lives and works in London. He completed his postgraduate studies at the Royal Drawing School in London, his undergraduate degree at Edinburgh College of Art, and spent several months on an exchange at St. Lucas, Ghent, Belgium. He's worked internationally at Everyday Gallery Antwerp, Gallery Wolfson Alberg, Gallery Drutzer, Berlin, Simchowitz, Los Angeles, and James Freeman in London. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, can you tell me a bit about how you both decided to do this podcast together and how it then came to be?
I think Mark should take that one because he came to my studio and proposed this idea.
Yeah, I think I had the idea in like 2019 or 2020 about starting a podcast centered around art history. And it took a couple of years for me to actually sort of like jump into action and dive in and start it, or like, try to like chase the idea. And basically, I was in the National Gallery one day and I just thought I should ask Olivia to if she wanted to do it. And I visited Olivia's studio in Haggerston, East London, I guess like just a little over a year ago, like 14 months ago. And I was, yeah, really excited at the prospect of it. And I didn't know if Olivia would be interested or up for it. But yeah, we just sort of like got started basically almost effective immediately. And we just dived in straight away.
How would you say your approach has been shaped by your careers as artists as opposed to how art historians like Nicola and myself might have approached it?
I think we both kind of approached it quite differently, and I think that's what makes it sort of interesting, as it varies episode to episode depending on who's presenting the painting. I think Mark talks about the painting itself and its visual aspects, and he very much selects like painters' paintings, and we do have quite like a sense of, oh, that one's very you, oh, that one's very you. And then I get very into the stories and the more of the like stories of the artists and stories and funny things around the paintings themselves. So I won't pick a painting unless I know there's lots of things to say about it. Whereas Mark could riff on the painting for the whole podcast if he wanted to.
I think that is definitely a bit of a temptation of mine. I think I'm definitely quite attracted to the drama in paintings and the theatrics. I think like my tendency as an artist is definitely like leaning into drama as well. Um and yeah, I don't know like in terms of like actually like choosing works and stuff. I think it's all very intuitive and often like I think like a lot of the works that we're like looking at are works that we've also been interested in individually for a really long time.
Yeah, can I ask you slightly more on how you like choose the paintings?
Yeah.
I know
I
you
like
said
I
you
like
don't
to
know.
choose ones by female artists if I can. But I also like to spread it out so we don't just do a whole season of female artists and then I'm a bit stuck. So I kind of try and find those works particularly. And I like keeping an eye on like if it's a recent acquisition or if something new has come to light about it, then that's generally how I might select it. Or if it's something I've always wanted to know a bit more about. But I won't write an episode on it if I can't find much information, which means sometimes a work absolutely fascinates me. Like the other week I wanted to do a trompe l'oeil by Marcos Correa, but there was absolutely nothing online about it at all, and I just had to give in and move on.
I'm quite different in the approach to choosing works. I think at the beginning we started trying to only choose works that we like had access to immediately that we would see like in London. So we started out like quite a lot at the National Gallery and like maybe a few at the British Museum and we were sort of like starting to like trying to basically only go and see works in person. And I think that kind of like only lasted a short period of time and we sort of opened it up to like works that could be anywhere basically. And I think in terms of like starting like a podcast and like talking about like works in history, I felt personally that I wanted to kind of like choose works to talk about that I had maybe invested quite a lot of time thinking about before. So just works that I felt like were kind of like within my comfort zone of talking about. And also taking it for granted that I, know that we were going to continue doing the podcast for like, the indefinite future. We're just going to like keep doing it. So it's kind of like starting out with what I was comfortable with, staying in the comfort zone of like I'm quite aware of like James Ensor's work or Bruegel's work. These are painters that I've spent a lot of time. Also, that's from like doing like studying in Belgium for several years that like I was introduced to a lot of these Flemish painters um and yeah, I think like just like so I think for like the sort of beginning that's sort of been something I've been quite conscious of is like thinking about works that were already very, very prominent in my focus as an artist.
Yeah. How do you then sort of both set about the researching process for them? Because you each take it in turn to teach the other about it. Do you kind of both go about the reading and research the same way, or do you have different approaches?
I think we're a bit different. If I have a book on it on that artist, then great. But I'm very I don't sort of have a hierarchy in research. Like I'm quite proud to be like, yes, and I found this on Wikipedia because it was the best source of information that I could find. So it's wherever I can find the information and I'll reference all that and write that out. But Mark quite likes to make an event of going and researching, so it's quite different for you. I'll sit in bed and do it, and Mark will leave the house and go to the British Library or something, won't you, Mark?
My favorite place in London, or like top one of my top three places in London to go to, is the Westminster Reference Library. I absolutely love it. I just so I think for like at least the first like at least like yeah, the first like 10 or I don't know how many episodes we're on now, but for a good chunk of it, I was always going to the Westminster Reference Library, and I would just basically go and I would go through like and look at all of the books that they have on one artist, and I would bring them all and set them all aside, and I would like go through all of the books and pour over them. And for me, actually, this was a really beautiful opportunity to actually like reintroduce research into my life because since like my undergraduate, I did no research. I mean, I would spend a lot of time looking at things and like diving into things, but in terms of like structural research, I was doing absolutely none. I would read a lot and listen to a lot of audiobooks and a lot of podcasts and like a little bit of a magpie. I would sort of like hop about, like just like taking what I can where I can. But yeah, like actually going to the library became, as Olivia said, quite an event for me that I just got really excited about it. So I'd bring a notebook and I sort of like I'm not doing this now, but at the beginning I had like one notebook that I was just like using for like all of the seasons basically. Um and yeah, I think I was sort of like a bit more interested in like anecdotal things at the beginning and like a little bit of biography. So like just trying to keep um a focus on like, like 20% biography, like 10 or 20% like anecdotal sort of things. And if I could find anything that was sort of yeah, like quite personal, or like quotes around, or like, and then also, yeah, I'll wrap up this question on that bit, like just going to like on the internet, like yeah, just scouring the internet to see if there's anything else made in reference to, which I mean that's kind of endless, but that's kind of like William Blake's poetry, for example, like going and finding like his poetry, and like so I'm quite interested in that, like including like I'm quite excited at the idea of like actually reciting like a full William Blake poem at the end of the episode or something like that. So it kind of varies quite a lot, I think.
We do try to caveat a lot of it though. We're like, we might quote, some kind of art historical myth that's not true, and we don't know that because we're not art historians. And I think that we're very like upfront about that. Like, if someone wants to email in and correct us, they're very welcome. This is what we found and put together and presented. And I think we're quite happy on like easy with the idea that maybe there's a lot more, or it might be wrong, but
Mm.
that's as much as we can do as artists and not being art historians.
100%. I would also like to follow up on that, that like actually when I talk about research, like my idea of research as a painter is quite different to an academic's idea of research. Because like as a painter, like my idea of research is like quite bumbly, like go into the library and just like pour through things quite excitedly and just like quite haphazardly take bits and pieces, and it's not like really um it's not quite the same as like an academic's approach to it, I would say.
Can I just interrupt there for a minute and say you might be surprised at how academics
Yeah.
research? I mean, I spend most of my time getting distracted by looking at painting. So I literally just, oh, that looks like that. And then I go off on a rabbit hole, down a rabbit hole. And I'm searching for an image that I know I've seen somewhere. So like I sort of stack up all these articles that I'm supposed to read, but actually I spend most of my time looking at images, which might surprise you, which probably are going to lead me nowhere, but just I get really excited by finding them.
Yeah. I think the artist perspective is what your whole podcast is kind of, it's what's very unique about it, is that you're not art historians anyway, so it's coming at it very freshly, and with, I think, a really sort of bright look at things. Slightly more on that, how do you find like that your tastes have tended to differ or be similar in the podcast? Or if you haven't found that they differed that much, what was kind of a moment that you really, really enjoyed or felt that came out and was really interesting?
What do you think, Olivia? How do our tastes
I
vary? Because
I
like
think they
we have
do differ.
overlap.
I think they do differ, but I think that's what makes it interesting. Is you make me look at paintings I wouldn't choose to, and I make you look at paintings you wouldn't choose to. And there's always something good that comes out of it. There's always something interesting you learn, or because I remember, I think, who was it? I think it was like Piero della Francesca, and I was like, oh, just because I did art history A level and I've been in the National Gallery with painters, like all my degrees and stuff were mostly painting focused or with painters. And so I've done a lot of looking at the artworks that painters enjoy. And I find it quite like funny being like, oh, these they like that one, they like that one, and they like that one. And I'm not a painter, so I don't get drawn to the same things. But then it was quite fun to actually talk about Piero della Francesca and like dig up a bit of art history A level. So things like unexpected things do come out of it, which is really nice.
Yeah, I think with that episode, we debated whether or not to actually record it. I think because we did a really intense sort of session of recording like 10 episodes in like a day and a half, or like maybe like just some like not even like two full working days. It was really one full working day spread out over 2 days. But then we recorded that one like maybe the last, and it actually was a really enjoyable conversation. Um, I think yeah, like the idea of like going beyond your comfort zone, like that's really interesting in general as a sort of like side topic. But yeah, overlapping, and I think I think there's certain artists that we also really both like enjoy a
Mm.
lot, like Goya, but we maybe both come at Goya from a different angle, maybe. Like I mean,
It's very much like, why did you pick that one?
yeah. I mean, like for me, for example, like um if I were interested in like choosing a Goya, it would probably be on the basis of like finding like if I were to look at like the cartoons specifically, I'd be interested in like um what about the scenes is like kind of dark or sinister, because there is a sort of suggestion and implicit darkness about it. So like I think that's maybe something that I'm quite interested in, is like I'm interested I don't know. I guess I do have a tendency like in paintings like towards things that have a bit of a darkness kind of going on in it. Like the witch paintings or like the dark like his black paintings or something. But I don't think I think Goya is definitely someone that we're both very, very interested in. Whereas when I chose the Bosch painting recently, you were like, this is the hardest painting to describe." Like,
Well, because we have a bit
This
at the
Bosch
beginning where
painting,
one of
wasn't
us
it?
describes it.
So can I just follow up on that? So Olivia, we've heard kind of what attracts Mark in a painting, and you said you chose mainly paintings about women. But what is it as a person who draws all the time that attracts you in a painting?
Well,
And what are you drawn to?
I make work that takes a very long time, so I like work that has stories, and because I like to feed as much interest and story into my work as I can. So I tend to, when it comes to the podcast, I'm drawn to things that I can find something really interesting to say about them, or that I think is really interesting. Um, yeah, I don't know, but I'm also very, very drawn to like the Spanish Golden Age and specific eras in art history. Yeah, or anything quite detailed.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was wondering, whether it's like detail and line. Because so if you chose a Goya, what would you choose in a Goya?
Oh, that's tough.
Sorry,
Um,
I'm obsessed with Goya at the moment. So
oh no, I just
yeah,
got back from
yeah,
Madrid, so definitely
yeah,
still obsessed with
yeah.
Goya. But he's one of the ones that me and my husband actually bonded over, because it was one of I took him to the Prado when we were just recently married, and he really loved Goya, and that was like something. So like everything Goya will, if it's presented to us, we'll take a look at it. So, and his biography is like fascinating. So, and I like anything Goya.
So it's not necessarily his
I even contemplate.
graphic work. It's not necessarily his graphic work that draws you in. Not the sort of line, the line-based stuff.
Not actually. Not. I mean,
Yeah,
obviously they're amazing, but they're not
yeah,
probably what I would go to. Probably would go towards the
yeah.
black paintings and the witch
Right.
paintings and the
Okay.
sort of the funny small works that
The
are telling
caprichos.
stories. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then I'll follow up on the other question I asked was, what's a moment that you've really enjoyed doing in the podcast that you've kind of had a revelation about, or just found really interesting?
I really loved
Great.
the episode that Olivia chose on Queen Joanna de Mad. Like I was thinking about it today, and I thought it just seemed it's just so complex, like her life and her story and like the narrative around it and um the sort of like potential like propaganda machine that sort of like was attached to that, like and how she was sort of like treated and perceived as a woman and like in grieving. And I just felt like everything that surrounded that painting in terms of like it's almost like a game of like Chinese whispers, like not knowing like what is true and what's not true. And like that just sort of all seems very applicable to today, in terms of like yeah, like how much information there is that we have access to, and like our own sort of like general sort of like level of distrust with like media and stuff like that, like like deep fakes or like things that are created AI generated imagery, and just not being able to hold on to the facts basically. But this painting of Queen Joanna de Mad, like it shows a woman like grieving the loss of her husband, and it's like a really grand epic painting. And yeah, there was just so much in it. So like I found that really, really fascinating. But I thought also like there's so many like complex parts to it in terms of like grief and like the truth and honesty um and yeah, like just in terms of like the politics sort of like surrounding it. I found that like really like an exceptionally enjoyable episode.
What was that painting? Was that one of the 19th century sort of history paintings of
It's one of
yeah.
the huge ones. There was another artist in the Carbonero as
Hmm.
well, and this one was Padilla
But
Ortiz.
Taylor, yeah.
Mm.
So it's
Yeah,
the
it was
19th century because they got very interested, the painters in Spain in the 19th century, in painting sort of episodes from their history, recreating the sort of a bit like the Princes in the Tower or something that we
yeah,
have
we
here. Yeah.
compared it to the Lady Jane Grey, I think, the
Oh,
execution
did you?
at the
Yeah.
National Gallery,
Yeah.
sort of saying
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
similar time period and a similar fascination
Exactly. Yeah.
state of
Yeah.
women.
Yeah, I was thinking of that actually. You're right. Yeah.
I really enjoyed Mark's Bosch episode, even though I didn't enjoy having to describe it. I did enjoy sort of finally putting a little like piece together in my brain and thinking, oh, actually, they're very much like the drawings you get in the margins of medieval manuscripts. And then I think that gave me an in into sort of actually enjoying all the details in the Bosch, whereas usually I'm just sort of, it's too much, it's too surreal. I'm not really into extreme surrealism and I walk away. But they actually gave me a little bit of an in into enjoying the painting more. So I liked that.
So fascinating, and everyone will have to go and listen to both of those episodes now. Next question will be, so conversely to what I asked you right at the beginning about how artists approach the history, how has kind of looking into and researching these paintings impacted on how you're making these art? And I'm assuming you have lots to say because I went to put together all of these images that you sent me into a slide, and some of them I thought were all very clearly meant to go together, and you've informed me that some of them you had not thought of that at all. So I'm excited to hear more of what you want to say about these.
Well, I told you I'd forgotten that you put one of my drawings next to a Manet, and I'd forgotten that I'd gotten the outfits from a Manet painting because I started that drawing about a year and a half ago. So I was like, oh
Yeah.
yes, that did come from Manet.
Yeah.
But it also, I mean, that it's that drawing in the middle, but that also comes from This Often Is But Anguissola, because I like the idea of women around a table and there being a kind of familiar relationship with them as well. But my work takes so long that I feel like I'll probably see the influence of things I've researched in about a year or two popping up in the drawings. It's like working through things I saw 2 years ago and working towards things in 2 years' time that I'm looking at now.
Yeah, I think for me, I have felt the influence of like the research and like just the activity of going out into the world with the intent of just looking, not really reading or listening, but just kind of the silence of looking and um and going and like taking my time and like walking through the National Gallery and spending like a lot of time with like Cranach or Vermeer or um any number of paintings really. But I think in that time, I think it has really like shifted and molded my idea of like I guess it's remolded and reshaped my idea of like what like painting or drawing can do, and um it's hard to kind of articulate like what exactly that was, but I think like before the podcast, like my research was mainly in my head basically. So I was basically thinking about what do I want, what do I want, what am I looking for, and then how do I find reference points to match that. Whereas when I go out into the world and look at things without the intention thinking, how can I take this and put it into a painting? I'm just going and looking. And that's quite a difference for me because before it was just like, how do I sort of like find something that looks like that? Whereas the podcast has brought me into museums and galleries more as a viewer of art rather than someone that's trying to collect things to put in paintings, which I think I was for quite a long time. And also it's made me want to make more works on paper, because of like coming like when you go through like artists' catalogs and monographs, you end up looking at like all of their work and you look at the earliest work and you look at the sketches and like for like Manet's Barra Folie Bergère, there was the little sketches for it, like the oil sketches for it, and then also coming across like Manet's submissions to like the salon and like looking at the drawings that he had made, and actually that he had collage drawings that he had sort of like he wanted it to look like a scribble that was on the back of a notebook, but actually he had made the sort of sketch and wasn't pleased with it, so cut it in half and then like brought in a new piece of paper next to it and then continued the drawing. So I thought, you know, his sort of approach to like works on paper and seeing that and seeing like the immediacy of like an artist's approach to um yeah, their works on paper just made me think I can't wait to go make some more works on paper.
I was thinking it's so interesting listening to the two of you talk about making the podcast. It's kind of like it's very much another topic completely than listening to you talking about a painter. Just how you approach the whole thing and what your tastes and your ideas are. So no, nothing. You keep going, Olivia. I know you've got some more interesting questions. So
Yeah, so I think then what we wanted to discuss was So it has looking at the histories of how different artists through history were able to make money through art, for example, guilds, patronage, the academy. Has it made you think differently about the realities of being an artist today, from funding to residency applications to finding gallery representations?
I guess I sort of thought of it as it's it seemed like it was the standard to get into a guild would be very, very high, a lot higher than it would be just to say I'm an artist and start putting your work on Instagram like today. But the level of support once you're in, it sort of felt like they would feed each other work a bit more and support each other if there was something that went wrong with a commission, or that there was a little bit that once you had that, you had some support and you had a name, and it was all very solid. Whereas I think today you can go to an art fair every year and see the same artist in a different booth with a different gallery every time you go around, and it feels a lot less like, it feels like everyone sort of tries you on for size a bit more and sees how you go, and like it's not a given. I remember at art school, people thought that they thought they'd graduate, get picked up by Saatchi, and be supported for the rest of their careers, and it's just not how it is. It's very much like people will, you'll get tried out by someone, and they'll see how it goes, and it's very like either it works or it doesn't, and then you move on. And it feels a little, when you're looking at artists working in those kinds of guilds, it feels like they had a bit more of a structure and a bit more of like I guess there's like a sort of respectability to it that sort of held them up a bit.
I think my takeaway of like how it all has worked in terms of like artist success and like patronage and like institutional support, like I think more often than not, the artists that I have gravitated toward like didn't actually have that much support, and like a lot of the artists were in like the Salon des Refusés and just doing their own thing. And I think what stood out to me was how often the work was like shunned or pushed aside or laughed at or attacked. You know, like Henri Rousseau's work was laughed at, balked at, and people thought it was horrendous. And it's also I think like to me what that spoke to me was about like the importance of like earnestness and like sincerity and naivety actually being like a really huge strength, you know, and like vulnerability. And I think like the more I look into works in history, the sort of um less importance I sort of find in like maybe like institutional or like established success in inverted commas, that um painters could be like very, very inconsistent or have like a pocket of like productivity where they're like making exceptional work, and then they could go through a period where they're like reinventing themselves and like finding all sorts of new things, and then they kind of like have another moment of, you know, like sort of like success sort of later in their career. And I think that's interesting, you know, because it's not always a sort of given that you will have that kind of support or something.
A very tough life, isn't it, being an artist? Yeah. I mean, I think it always has been, because even artists that got supported by, rich patrons often had trouble being paid. And, some of them died in poverty. I mean, there's a wonderful female sculptor called Louisa Roldan. I don't know if you've come across her work. She started making polychrome wood carved sculpture with her father and her husband in Seville.
Mm.
And then she started making smaller pieces in terracotta and went to Madrid and was working for the King of Spain, became the first woman painter to the King of Spain, sort of official painter. But she died in poverty because they never used to pay her. They never used to pay what they were supposed to pay.
Mm.
Yeah, she died a pauper, even though, she was in Madrid and, in this court circle. So I think it's always been very tough. But,
Yeah.
so good on you guys. I guess you spend a lot of your life applying for grants and, you know, doing other things to support yourselves as well.
I feel
Yeah.
quite fortunate that I went to art school like between 2010 and 2014, because it was sort of like just on the cusp before like Instagram sort of like created a whole new world of market, and like before like the art world kind of changed. Because when I was at art school, like you know, like a successful artist was someone who had a job 3 days a week and just managed to keep painting or drawing or making for like 10, 15 years, you know. And like in 2012 to 2014, like a young artist was someone who was 55, who was getting shows. That was considered young. And that changed really dramatically within 2 years. So I feel quite fortunate to have had that, because obviously it's easy to, like, to see that sort of shift and think like to kind of like lean into or adopt that kind of mentality. But I think like having a duality of like just on the cusp before that time's quite useful, really.
And then finally, before we ask if there's any other questions, you choose mainly, or I think almost all pre-20th century works, which obviously aligns really well with Athena and what we do here. What are kind of your thoughts on, like, I mean, is it just a matter of taste, or is there kind of some other kind of aim in sort of how do you think about the relevance of these works today, basically, is what I wanted to ask.
I think that was that was kind of my fault. I put that parameter on as it being pre-20th century. But mostly because I found as a non-painter, I found my time in art school quite difficult, and I'd often be asked to look at things I wasn't interested in, and I'm not very good at feigning interest, and I'd be surrounded by a lot of painters who were interested in specific paintings by specific artists, and I just didn't want to jump onto a project and then sort of sit there every other week and not be interested in what Mark had to say or the things that he was bringing, or feeling that there was any angle for me to get interested into it. And it doesn't mean I don't like contemporary painters, but my field of interest is much narrower when it comes to that. Whereas when it's art historical, I'm much more engaged. I had a really great A-level art history teacher, and she made it all really fun and interesting, and ensured that I went on the school trip to Florence, and we went to little galleries, just me and her, because she knew I was like so into things. So I think for me, I was like, Mark proposed the idea of the podcast, and I put that little boundary. Mark could very well go and do a separate contemporary art podcast, and that would be fine.
I was really happy with the constraint. I think it's really good to have constraints, and also like on my undergraduate, you know, there's no shortage of material on artists living in the 20th century. You know, like I think yeah, there's just no shortage of it, and it's good to have an excuse to like, you know, really live with paintings before that time. And it's also like it brings with it fresh challenges, that there are certain works that you might want to look into and research, and there might not be that much on it. So that's a challenge, and a really enjoyable challenge. So yeah, I think it's really nice. And I think there's also just like no shortage of like incredible paintings throughout history. So there's plenty to get into.
Yeah, I mean, that's also so interesting and wonderful. We've got just one I think we did have two people in the audience now. We've got someone else. So if anyone does want to ask any questions, please feel free now. Or Nicola, if you have more questions to ask. Yeah.
I do have one question, which is that I noticed that most of your works, I think there might be one or two, but most of them are by European artists, I think. Have you thought about looking at, there's one is it about Mughal miniatures?
Yeah,
There's
we did
those,
a Japanese woodblock print and a
right,
Mughal miniature.
yeah.
My thing with that is we really want to include non-European artists, but I don't want to talk about works that are non-European if I haven't seen them, because I just feel like there's a sort of I do need to go and see it and appreciate it, and I don't want to just, it feels wrong to just read about it in the book, in the same way as I wouldn't make a drawing of a place I haven't been that's outside of Europe. It just feels
Hmm.
kind of slightly culturally inappropriate to not have
Hmm.
gone and experienced it and be able to talk about it in a really informed manner. I feel that extra pressure to do it properly.
Hmm.
And that's really the only reason, is when we have the time and the capacity to go and look at these works in the British Museum or the V&A together, we do. But at the minute, because we've been living sort of separate places, I've been doing more book research on things I have seen before in the Prado or in the National Gallery, and then you're feeding those into the podcast. But we're definitely not a just European podcast. It's just been the sort of the way things have gone in the last season of it.
I think also just to add on to that, like for me personally, like I think starting out like a sort of new endeavor and a new project, it's like there's already a lot of like new things to sort of juggle. And yeah, just like for me personally, like my choice of like a lot of the artists that I've looked at are just it's on the basis of just like what I had maybe spent time looking at on my undergraduate through to like my postgraduate or works in the last decade that I've also, like Olivia said, have seen in person that kind of have shaped my perspective on like what I'm doing right now. And like there are definitely like other influences like within like my practice and like my work in general, but I think um there's also something about knowing that you're like speaking and it's like you're having a conversation that's going to be recorded and it's going to be on the internet and it's going to be there for people to consume. And in the back of my head you have the voice of like, well, like people when anything's in a public space it can be picked apart, so it's like wanting to be like really really super comfortable and confident about like what space you're in and occupying, that you can say that like I haven't chosen a Rubens for example yet, but like I could quite comfortably talk about a Rubens that I spent like an hour with in Antwerp and 5 or 10 years ago. And it's just, I think it's just so it's like for me personally, it's about cultivating comfort and confidence in like publicly speaking about something that like is technically not really my realm because I'm not an art historian. So it's just for me, it's kind of like baby steps, getting to a place where it's like and then also like what that brings in as well is like thinking about this comfort of like stepping outside my comfort zone and thinking like, okay, like I want to go and talk about something that like I'm very much not that familiar with as well. But I think also like being at art school in the UK, like there is definitely like a certain filter and lens around like what you're taught basically.
Oh, well, I did have a question. Well, thank you all. First of all, this was so informative and really cool to see your own work contrasted with the paintings that you had talked about. I suppose I was wondering if you both felt that your artistic process had sort of been impacted by like this heightened sort of attention that you'd been paying like through the podcast to just like the process of creating these works, or like just sort of that like you were saying, like when you were in school, even paintings that you'd studied however many years ago would like stick very firmly in your mind. And I was wondering, like getting sort of back into that research and like studious mind space, like you were saying, impacted also the art that you've been making.
Definitely. And I think like we entered into it knowing that it would be really good to have to sit down and do research every week on a painting and have to learn something new. And that was sort of like it's like forcing that research on yourself, but in a really positive way. And I do think that does feed into the work that you make. Like as I said, mine kind of feeds in very slowly because I'm still sort of processing things I looked at 2 years ago. But it's starting to creep in and it's starting to like give me a sort of level of comfort around things that I'm looking at, and then being able to identify like an artist in the gallery more, or being able to sort of identify something that I think is going to inspire something later is really nice, because it's sort of you're not just sort of looking at one person and going, well, I know about this artist, so I'm just going to reference their paintings, and it broadens up like even just being in the Prado recently and looking at all the Juan Carreño de Miranda paintings, which I didn't really know much about at all until I researched him for the podcast. And then going into an old master gallery and seeing some Juan Carreño de Miranda and being like, okay, so like, it's nice to sort of put it all together into context and then wonder how you can feed it back in. Because in 2020, I put one of his works in a drawing and it felt like a fun addition, whereas now it's like, oh, I know all this stuff about the artist, and it feels much more sort of weighted to add them into a work now, and somewhat like in some ways more exciting.
I think for me the main shift has been like sort of like relearning how to read a painting and to actually look at the narratives and themes and motifs, and like also to be a bit more comprehensive in looking at an artist's whole oeuvre and looking at the changes. So before I was a lot more focused on the micro and the detail, and I was always interested in just finding like what I would see or read as like an event which was just sort of like orchestrated really um in a really enticing manner, you know. Like for example, to be specific about that, like there's a painting in the Louvre of Saint Michael vanquishing Satan, and it's by the Atelier of Raphael. And for me, like when I, as a viewer of our pre-podcast, I would walk through museums quite blind, not really that interested, but just looking for images that like would grab me and arrest my attention. Um, Whereas now I still will do that, but I now have the other side where I'll be like looking at the entire oeuvre of an artist, and I'll be looking at how that transition has like what that transition looks like, and what the sort of like peaks and troughs of their creative output is like, and then also like thinking about like the themes within the work and the motifs and like what they put attention on, like what they are hammering home, like this is what the most important thing is. And I think um and then I think that sort of like that feeds into my work in terms of I think about like, well, what kind of themes am I looking at, and like what's my relationship to color like, and how am I approaching that, and am I really challenging myself? Like at what points for me, like I'll look at an artist and think like what at what point, like when there's the tipping point of like from this kind of like period of work into another, like where is the tension, where is the tipping point, where is the challenge in that transformation? Like, how are they pushing beyond, and what are they leaving behind, and what are they taking in now, as opposed to what they were doing before? So I'm quite interested in that shift and that change. And I think, yeah, that feeds into my work in terms of just thinking about themes, actually.
Thank you both so much. Those were both incredible answers.
Thank you so much for talking with us this evening. It's been such a pleasure and so interesting to hear all about the podcast and how it's evolved and shaped you. Yeah, I don't know if you have any final notes to add, or anything else that either of you want to say, or Nicola, if you have any final notes.
No, just thank you very much.
Yeah.
That was really, really interesting. And I'm sort of gonna listen to some more of the podcast.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you
And
for
your
having
work is so different, and it's really interesting to see, how you approach things mentally as well, differently. So
Okay,
thank
so
you.
I mean, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you so
Yeah.
much, Mark and Olivia, for talking with us today.
Thank you.